So this video resumes on page 103 of Blood Brothers. The last thing that we covered at the end of the previous video was the betrayal by Mrs. Lyon of her own son, where she points out to Mickey that Edward and Linda are together. We talked about the cyclical significance of Mickey hammering on his own door, just as he did when he was a child. And that is emphasised because the stage direction says, as the music abruptly segues, segue in this context meaning a sort of seamless switch from the sort of sad tone, the sort of lament of Mrs. Johnston, into the more aggressive music that will dominate this last section of the play. But Mickey is heard hammering on his door and calling for Linda as he once did for his mother. So if you were in any doubt about the structural significance of that cyclical thing, the fact that Willie Russell emphasises it in his stage direction, when, let's face it, that's not something that would be immediately apparent on stage, other than visually in your memory of it. But it demonstrates its significance. It says that the music pulsates and builds as he runs for to his mother's house. He enters and flings back the floorboard to reveal the gun hidden by Sammy. Think back to when he was a child and he first told Edward the first time they met that he knew where Sammy kept his toy gun. Even though we're now, who knows, 20 years older or something like that, perhaps not quite 20, the fact that we're in a different house, it's still significant, because that gun that we talked about is going to be now playing a key role. It says then that Mrs. Johnston enters just as Mickey disappears with the gun. Now, you'll notice here then that that's twice in the last few pages where there's been this reference to things happening just too late. A couple of pages ago, we saw where Mickey finally made a serious attempt to stop taking his drugs, his medication, just too late after Linda's mind was made up. We see it again in a sense here. Mrs. Johnston, who could have held Mickey back, is just too late. Again, it's a sort of tragic type motif, and it re-emphasises to us this idea that it's fate that's determining events now, that mere human interaction will not stop it. So, Mrs. Johnston screams, "Mickey, Mickey." Now, we've said that the pace of this text has risen quite significantly in the previous pages. And if you think about what that looks like in terms of our diagram of the tragic arc, very much you see, having gone through the climax, through the happiest points, you see now the descent towards nemesis, towards destruction and death. The music at this point, very much in its pulsating and so on, emphasises this pace and this aggression. We see Mickey comb the town, breaking through groups of people, looking, searching, desperate, not even knowing what he's looking for or what he is going to do. His mother is frantically trying to catch him, but not succeeding. Now, it's worth bearing in mind there that in reference to not even knowing what he's doing, that in a sense Mickey too has been driven mad. First of all by guilt at what he did, and of course secondly now by the betrayal of Mrs. Lyons. He's been driven mad, and this is now the consequences that we are seeing. And the narrator, we have talked about the role played by the narrator as this fateful symbol. We very much see that here, particularly because you suddenly realise, I think at this point, that the narrator has been on stage throughout the previous couple of pages. Certainly he hasn't just entered, and therefore again it's the fact that throughout this section he has been this kind of, again, a looming presence, a fateful, foreboding presence. And when he sings that there's a man gone mad in the town tonight, again, there's an echo of the song sung by the children about Mrs. Lyons. In the end, all these characters are victims of society. He goes mad, she goes mad. They are all victims. It's not in this play, and anybody who will argue, as many people do, that this is a play about the struggles of the working class, yes, but no, it's more than that. It's about the struggles of society as a whole. Yes, the working class struggles more, but it's about the struggles of society as a whole, as represented by the fact that they both go mad. So the narrator continues, there's a man gone mad in the town tonight, he's going to shoot somebody down. There's a man gone mad, lost his mind tonight, there's a madman, there's a madman, there's a madman running round and round. You don't need me to talk about the dramatic sense or caused by all that repetition. And now he goes back into a song that of course we've heard before. Now you know the devil's got your number, he's running right beside you, he's screaming deep inside you, and someone said he's calling your number up today. Notice in terms of structural progression that every time this song emerges, gradually the imagery of the devil is closer to you, and now it's not merely close, but look at that, deep inside you. In other words, the consequences of your actions have finally caught up. Over onto page 100 before then, as Mrs. Johnston makes her way to Linda's house. He continues to say, there's a madman, there's a madman, there's a madman. Mrs. Johnston hammers on Linda's door, shouting her name. Linda, just returning home, comes up behind her. Ma'am, what? Mrs. Johnston is out of breath and gasps, Mickey's got gun. Mickey? Eddie? The town hall? Now, is it Linda's sense of guilt that the first thing she thinks about is Eddie? Does she perhaps, is that why she immediately jumps to that conclusion? Perhaps she's conscious of what she has done. Mrs. Johnston says, what? Linda begins to run and shouts, Eddie Lyons. Of course, remember, Linda still doesn't know who Eddie Lyons really is. The narrator, who's still there, continues and says, there's a madman running round and round, you know the devil's got your number, you know he's right beside you, he's screaming deep inside you, and someone said he's calling your number up today. Repetition only adds further emphasis. Now, we're now about to enter the last scene of this play, because on the last three words of the chorus, Mrs. Johnston runs off. On the last today, the music stops abruptly and we have a moment of silence. This is the calm, as it were, before the final storm. We see Edward standing behind a table on a platform. He is in the middle of addressing his audience. Two counsellors stand either side. This is now Edward, the local politician. It's significant that we see him in the middle of his action, because it emphasises just how far he's come and just how much further he's come compared to Mickey. We see him in all his respect and all his authority. Even the fact that he is standing in itself is significant symbolically. The proxemics there demonstrate his power. And we see his speech. We see it is authoritative. We see that it is powerful. It emphasises that point. And if for once I agree with Councillor Smith, you mustn't hold that against me. But in this particular instance, yes, I do agree with him. You're right, Bob, there is a light at the end of the tunnel. Quite right. None of us would argue with you on that score. But what we would question is this. How many of us see that there in his balanced speech, in the seriousness and sobriety of his language? We see him. It's his greatest moment. We see what he has become. But from his audience, a commotion is beginning. He thinks he is being heckled and so tries to carry on. In fact, his audience is reacting to the sight of Mickey appearing from the stalls, a gun held two-handed to steady his shaking hands and pointing directly at Edward. Edward turns and sees Mickey as someone on the platform next to him realises the reality of the situation and screams. Now, it's worth bearing in mind what we mentioned a little while ago, that Mickey does not turn up here with a plan to commit premeditated murder. That's not what we are specifically seeing here. Yes, he's angry. Yes, he's wounded and hurt, but that is not his intention. Look at that. The fact that the gun is held two-handed to steady his shaking hands. The shaking hands demonstrate his fear, his indecision. You might also link it to what we said before about the fundamental weakness of his character. Now, he shouts, "Stay where you are." Mickey stops a couple of yards from Edward. He's unsteady and breathing awkwardly. Again, unsteady, linking back to the shaking hands. Edward eventually says, "Hello, Mickey." And he says, "I stopped taking the pills." "Oh." Eventually says, "I began thinking again. You see," and then he waves to the counsellors. "Just get out of here, mister, now." And the counsellors hurry off. Once again, the fact that he actually takes the time to protect them by sending them away is further evidence of his fundamental decency as a character. Now, Edward and Mickey are alone on the platform. So, in a sense, we're almost back to how this play began. The two brothers together. And he says, "I had to start thinking again, because there was one thing left in my life. Just one thing I had left, Eddie, Linda, and I wanted to keep her. So I stopped taking the pills, but it was too late. Do you know who told me about you and Linda? Your mother. She came to the factory and told me." Now, a couple of things there. First of all, reference again to being too late. Again, we talked about the role that fate plays. This idea that if events had happened differently, had been timed differently even, there could have been a different outcome. But the reality was there was never going to be a different outcome. It was always going to end like this. The consequences of those actions taken by those characters at the beginning of this play would always lead to this. So, Edward goes on and says, "Mickey, I don't know what she told you, but Linda and I are just friends." Mickey shouts for the first time and says, "Friends? I could kill you. We were friends, weren't we? Blood brothers, wasn't it?" "Yes, Mickey, I remember." Now, it's difficult here, isn't it? Because on the one hand, yes, there isn't a great deal that has gone on between Edward and Linda, but in spirit, I think it's fair to say that there has been a kind of betrayal, and Edward is trying to sort of justify it, but really, it's very difficult indeed. Now, the last time they met, it's interesting how Edward was the one who reminded Mickey about being blood brothers, and Mickey was the one who dismissed it as being more grown up. But isn't it interesting that now Edward is the adult in the room? Edward is the one who has grown up and become the respected member of society, and suddenly Mickey is the one who's left with nothing, and therefore isn't it interesting that now it's him who is reminding them about the blood brothers? So Mickey says, "Well, how come you got everything and I got nothing?" That's what this comes down to in the end. It's envy. The fact that his life has turned out so dreadfully and Eddie seems to have been such a success. He says, "Friends, I've been thinking again, Eddie. You and Linda were friends when she first got pregnant, weren't you?" See the paranoia. See the impact that it's having on him. This is now how desperate he is, that he is going back and he's questioning everything. "Mickey," says Edward, shocked by this accusation. And Mickey says, "Does my child belong to you as well as everything else? Does she, Eddie? Does she?" Edward shouts, "No, for God's sake." And there's a pause. From the back of the auditorium, we hear a policeman through a loud hailer. And number one says, "Now listen, son, listen to me. I've got armed marksmen with me, But if you do exactly as I say, we won't need to use them, will we? Now look, Michael, put down the gun. Just put down the gun, son. Mickey dismisses their presence and continues to talk to Eddie to say, "What am I doing here, Eddie? I thought I was going to shoot you, but I can't even do that. I don't even know if the thing's loaded." Again, think about that. I can't even do that. The weakness in him. And in fact, when he goes to shoot him in a moment, it will really be almost an accident. Mrs. Johnston slowly walks down the centre aisle towards the platform. The second policeman says, "What's that woman doing? Get that woman away!" Oh, Christ. Mrs. Johnston desperately now is trying to defuse this situation, and she says, Mickey, don't shoot him, Mickey." But Mickey continues to hold the gun in position and says, "Go away, ma'am, you go away from here." "No, son," and she walked onto the platform. Contrast here, interestingly enough, contrast the strength that she shows. We've said, haven't we, before, about the strength that women show in keeping things going, and even the strength that Mrs. Johnston shows, I suppose, in keeping her family going as best she can after her husband leaves her. Now Mickey shouts in warning, "Ma'am!" But she speaks again. "Mickey, don't shoot Eddie. He's your brother. You had a twin brother. I couldn't afford to keep you both of you. His mother couldn't have kids. I agreed to give one of you away." There, she said it. Finally, the truth has come out. Finally now, this is the price being paid. Now, there was as it were, an invented superstition of Mrs. Johnston's earlier, Mrs. Lyons earlier on, this idea that if either twin should know each other again, they would both immediately die. Now that was invented, but of course it becomes a kind of hostage to fortune in its own right, because that's what we're going to see now. The knowledge of that, and the knowledge of that betrayal, is about to now do the final act of damage. Mickey's response is not necessarily what you'd expect. Something begins deep down inside him, and he roars, "You!" and screams, "You! Why didn't you give me away?" So in the end, it's that envy, his life of suffering and hardship. That's what saddens him. He stands glaring at her, almost uncontrollable with rage. I could have been him. That's all he can think, that he could have had a better life. Now on the word him, Mickey waves at Edward with his gun hand. The gun explodes and blows Edward apart. Now, that's significant. He just waves the gun. It's not deliberate. It's not intentional. This is not the conscious act of a being with free will. This is fate intervening. Mickey turns to the policeman, screaming the word no. They open fire and 4 guns explode, blowing Mickey away. Linda runs down the aisle. Now, there, both boys are dead by accident. It's fate now talking. The policemen are heard through the loud hailer, saying, "Nobody move, please. It's all right. It's all over. Just stay where you are." And there is music. As the light on the scene begins to dim, we see the narrator watching. Always the narrator. Now, the speech which he's about to make is usually seen as being a sort of manifesto from Willie Russell. It's usually seen to be explaining his view of these events. However, I actually call it slightly into question. So, the narrator then says, "And do we blame superstition for what came to pass? Or could it be what we, the English, have come to know as class?" Now, that's the thing. Notice, not working class or middle class, but class. The divisions in society as a whole. These are the problems that Russell is talking about, not any one class or the other. He's not saying working class good, middle class bad. God knows he shows the working class to have enough flaws. And suddenly he, now again emphasizing the cyclical nature, reverts back to the lines of his own prologue at the beginning of this play. Did you ever hear the story of the Johnston twins, as like each other as two new pins, how one was kept and one given away, how they were born and they died on the self-same day? In that quatrain we have the full story of this play encapsulated. And so we're left now with almost a kind of epilogue from Mrs. Johnston. It's where the play began. It began with her singing, "Tell me it's not true." And she sings, "Tell me it's not true, say it's just a story." The implication, therefore, suggesting that she is in denial about the reality of this. Because, of course, on the one hand, there's an irony. This is not true. We're watching a work of fiction. But what Willie Russell is trying to imply is that on some level there is something true to life about the events of this play. He's trying to show us that this is the kind of thing that can happen. In a sense, it's a kind of modern fairy tale. He's showing us about the consequences of the society that we live in. And yes, the implication is therefore that this is true in some level. Goes on then, "Say it's just a story, something on the news, tell me it's not true, though it's here before me. Say it's just a dream, say it's just a scene from an old movie of years ago, from an old movie of Marilyn Monroe." In other words, wishing that it could be fiction, but it isn't. It continues then, "Say it's just some clowns, two players in the limelight, and bring the curtain down. Say it's just two clowns who couldn't get their lines right. Say it's just a show on the radio that we can turn over and start again, that we can turn over, it's only a game." So, the reference to movies, the reference to shows, again it links back to that theme of escapism that we've talked about before. But this time it's something again that she longs for because it's preferable to what's happened. She wishes that this were not happening. You've also got the reference to "it's only a game." We talked about that in Act 1, the idea that games are something that do not have consequences and therefore can be seen as a representation of childhood, in contrast to adulthood, which is shown to have such consequences. And now the final page. "Tell me it's not true, say I only dreamed it, and morning will come soon. Tell me it's not true, say you didn't mean it, say it's just pretend, say it's just the end of an old movie from years ago, of an old movie with Marilyn Monroe." Most of the things there really, I think, echo what we said before. When it says things like "say it's just pretend," you implicate, again, this is Russell trying to imply that we're seeing true consequences of social problems here. And when she talks about "say that morning will come soon," it's quite a pessimistic view, because the implication is that perhaps morning won't. The implication is that there is no hope, that our society is broken. There's a longing from Mrs. Johnston that there can be a happier future, but the implication here is that there can't be, that that is simply another fiction. And that concludes this play. Thank you.